With us to dissect the U.S. operation and what could come next is former CIA Director General David Petraeus. The general also led the U.S. military operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Hi, General Petraeus. Pleasure to welcome you back to our program. Thank you very much for making the time.
Good to be with you again, Vashi. Thanks.
I wanted to start off, sir, given your extensive experience in both the military and the CIA, by asking about the operation itself. What stands out to you about what unfolded in Venezuela?
Well, how masterful it was, frankly. This was an enormous operation, over 150 aircraft of all different types, launched from 20 different locations, all brought together, having, of course, been exhaustively rehearsed prior to this, but all the actions synchronized. The supposedly sophisticated Chinese and Russian air and ballistic missile defense systems rendered incapable, destroyed, and no loss of life on the U.S. side, damage to an aircraft, a couple of soldiers wounded, but really an extraordinarily impressive display of American military power.
I had read on a number of occasions that there was a CIA team that was there since, it could have been since August, essentially tracking the Maduro's movements and accumulating all the intelligence. Can you reflect a little bit on what an operation like that would entail?
Well, let me just reflect on the fact that when you're doing this kind of operation, essentially a manhunt operation, we've had many examples of this over the recent decades. The operation to bring Osama bin Laden to justice, the operations to take out the top leaders of Al-Qaeda in Yemen or Iraq or Islamic State leaders in Syria and so forth. So you establish pattern of life. You understand as much about the activities of the individual and those around him and so forth as you possibly can. And that involves more than just intelligence, human intelligence sources. It involves every technical capability that we can draw on as well, including open source intelligence. But all of this clearly was employed in this case. Reportedly, there was a mock used exactly a model of what it was that housed Maduro, and these forces had trained on this model, as they did, of course, prior to the operation to take down Osama bin Laden. This is all part of the normal approach to these operations. Indeed, they were ready to go earlier. They just needed the window of weather that finally materialized. But again, a very, very impressive, very complex operation, orchestrated magnificently.
When you look back, or when collectively we look back over the past few months, and the vessels, for example, all the incursions into the Caribbean, does it feel now like the intent was always to head in this direction, that was almost inevitable?
No, not at all. Keep in mind that Maduro was offered options. Yeah. He could have had exile in Turkey, I think Iran, other countries were held out to them. By the way, that's pretty instructive to the others now, as we begin to work with the acting president, who all of a sudden is, instead of striking a defiant tone, seems to be quite pliant and ready to carry out the directions of our Secretary of State and the others who will guide the actions of Venezuela, ultimately leading to what the president referred to, and now Secretary of State Marco Rubio has as well, which is a transition to presumably an elected government.
Do you think we can be sure that is presumably what will happen, and what sort of things will you?
No, many uncertainty.
Okay, so let me follow up and then ask sort of what you will be watching for in order to try and get some more certainty over the coming days and weeks.
Well, what I think the regime members, and of course who've just basically taken out one, the very top, Maduro, and of course his wife, who was in league with him in many of these activities, and brought them to justice. And I'm pleased to see that take place, given his extraordinarily brutal track record over the years, and the damage and destruction he's brought to the Venezuelan people and to their economy. But what we'll be watching for is, are these individuals responsive to directions from the United States? And how is it they're going to extricate themselves and avoid putting themselves on the X, as they say, becoming a target of this impressive U.S. military capability that we saw exercised in bringing Maduro to justice. I suspect they're going to try to cut deals over time. It's possible some elements within it could even come forward and say, we'll be the ones. But there's going to be an awful lot of that kind of activity ongoing in Venezuela. But keep in mind that this is a regime that was defeated overwhelmingly at the polls in 2024, and by nearly 2-to-1 margin. There's considerable evidence of this. This is not just speculation. They have the tabulations at the different polling sites. But Maduro refused to honor the outcome of that election, claimed that he had won by a narrow majority, and refused to leave office. So we'll have to see now. They're going to have to allow at some point in time either additional elections or a transition to the government that was elected in 2024.
It's interesting that you say that. So you think that will have to be the case. And I ask because it's interesting to watch the way in which the U.S. president is characterizing the motivation, right? So in the past, you might have heard there's some talk, obviously, about restoring true democracy, and in particular what happened in the last election, as you referenced. But there's a lot also about other motivations, including more U.S. access, to put it quite bluntly, to Venezuelan oil. So if the impetus is described, not solely about restoring democracy and not even close to solely, will that, do you think, have an impact on democracy actually taking hold?
I think that is actually the objective at this point. Again, there's just a transcript of a conversation between Secretary of State Rubio and his Dutch counterpart that implies a transition, again, to that kind of government. Look, there's a lot of motivations here. There's by no means all about the oil. It's about someone defying an American president, refusing options that could have kept him from this situation. Instead of spending exile comfortably in Turkey with his ill-gotten gains, he's likely going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. That's a pretty powerful example for those who are left and those who now all of a sudden are striking a much more compliant tone. But there's a number of challenges here. They're just enormous. And we'll have to see, again, how each of these plays out over time. But I suspect that the acting president now realizes that if she does not comply with what the U.S. directs her to do, that she could very well end up on the X herself.
The president has responded to a number of questions over the past 2 days from reporters or brought it up himself as to the idea of additional military action in other areas, other countries, I should be more specific: Cuba, Colombia, Denmark, Mexico even. And he hasn't ruled, it's different answers to be specific, but he hasn't ruled anything out. Does the military in the United States have the capacity to do all of that at once, should that actually be the president's objective?
Well, it certainly doesn't have the capacity to do everything all at the same time, plus ensure deterrence in the Indo-Pacific and continue to support allies and friends in the Middle East, and ideally continue to support Ukraine as well. There's always risk involved with concentrating large numbers of assets in one theater versus what they could be doing in other theaters. That has always been the trade-off. I've been asked, for example, how long can the United States maintain the forces that it has in the Southern Command area of responsibility right now? The answer is as long as we want to, but recognizing that there would be risk taken in other theaters as a response, as a result of that. But look, I think a lot of these are for future leverage down the road. Colombia, look, they have elections coming up within a few months. I very seriously doubt that there would be any activity taken there, even though there are certain frustrations about what's going on. And let's recognize that the drugs that were coming out of Venezuela were actually cultivated and produced in Colombia. They have the largest amount of hectares under cultivation for coca that they have ever had, vastly greater by orders of magnitude than when I was, for example, the director of the CIA, and we worked with the Colombian government to drive cultivation down under 30,000 hectares. It's well over 200,000 now. There are other reasons for concern, and in a variety of other locations as well. But I think in the vast majority of cases, the military leverage is helpful, but you don't ever have to actually employ it.
Okay, I have to leave it on that note. General Petraeus, appreciate your analysis this evening very much. Thank you.
Always good to be with you, Vashi.